Hey Wisecrack, Jared here to gaze into the abyss once more with everyone's favorite arts and crafts show. After it was seemingly cancelled in 2015 when Season 2 bombed, True Detective is back for a third season, and as you might guess, we're watching closely. The first season was one of the most philosophically rich shows on TV, and it's had a big influence on the crime genre for the last 6 years. As countless articles have noted, the philosophy of pessimism is at the core of True Detective. And while philosophical themes are plastered all over media as of late,
time is a flat circle.
True Detective is the only one brave enough to respond.
I said, Nietzsche, shut the f up.
But the pessimism of True Detective extends just beyond the ramblings of Rust Cohle. It permeates the very fabric of the show, woven into its aesthetic, its many references to other works, and even its missteps. So join us on this dismal journey through eternity as you realize that you will watch this video over and over again. And of course, spoilers ahead for seasons 1 and 2, but who are we kidding? This episode is 95% season 1. First, a quick recap. Season 1 follows detectives Rust and Cohle, a man broken by the death of his daughter with a rather bleak outlook on life.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space.
And Martin Hart, a man trying to do the right thing in all the wrong ways. They track down a brutal killer with a penchant for creepy iconography and uncover a massive statewide conspiracy to abduct kids. In Season 2, the show relocates to an industrial desert town in California and introduces a few too many new characters, including Vince Vaughn as the living embodiment of every gangster cliche. Like Season 1, these three cops and independent businessman are set on the trail of a killer who murdered a corrupt city manager, causing all sorts of chaos around the state. What both seasons achieve, though definitely not equally, is creating an atmosphere of pessimism.
In philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist.
Pessimism has many different flavors, but philosopher Eugene Thacker describes it as being marked by an unwillingness to move beyond the worst.
The ontological fallacy of expecting a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, that's what the preacher sells. Same as a shrink.
See, this is a school of thought that believes not that the glass is half empty, but that the glass is broken, the drink has ruined your carpet, and the shards have cut your hands. Whereas an optimist might postulate that we live in the best of all possible worlds, the pessimist would agree but respond that this is the essence of the problem. Since this is the best the universe has to offer,
F this world, man. Nice hook, Marty.
The feeling of dread and doom in each episode is as palpable as the memory of eating month-old Dominoes. But how does it manage this? Let's look at 3 of the best methods True Detective uses to make one of the most pessimistic shows on television. Method 1. Style. One of the things True Detective masterfully accomplishes is creating an atmosphere of pessimism. Now, part of that is the visuals, and we'll get there, but much of the show's pessimistic aesthetic was inspired by literature. Before he made True Detective, creator and writer Nick Pizzolatto was a novelist, and as such drew heavily from other novelists like Cormac McCarthy, William Faulkner, Thomas Ligotti, and more. Cormac McCarthy's novels, like The Road and Child of God, explore the degradation of the landscape alongside the character's morality and reveal the worst inclinations of human beings, something explored in True Detective.
This place is like somebody's memory of a town, and the memory's fading. It's like there was never anything here but jungle.
McCarthy's narrators and characters often speak in dark monologues and make crass asides similar to Cole's.
All the dick swanger you roll, you can't spot crazy pussy.
The show also seems to draw inspiration from William Faulkner's Sanctuary, sometimes called the original Southern Gothic novel. Southern Gothic is a genre that's typically set in southern states with grotesque characters, gallows humor, and transgressive behavior with elements of horror and the unexplained. Sanctuary is set in the same rural parts of Louisiana as Season 1 of True Detective, and is a story of rape, attempted kidnapping, and the wrong man being lynched and burned. But one of Pizzolatto's biggest influences was horror writer Thomas Ligotti's nonfiction work, Conspiracy Against the Human Race. So much so that Pizzolatto was accused of plagiarizing it. Whether it's Faulkner telling us about the realities of Southern justice, you're not being tried by common sense, you're being tried by a jury. McCarthy's pitch black imagery, each leaf that brushed his face deepened his sadness and dread. They rode over his face like veils, their veins like slender bones where the sun shone through them. Or Ligotti's violent references to the cosmos. I wanted to do things to Richard that would make the sun grow cold with horror.
Rust, pick up, fight with the sky, didn't like its shade of blue.
These books feature the same grim poetry that paints humanity as little more than a cesspool. But Pizzolato's biggest literary influences on True Detective are arguably James Lee Burke for Season 1 and James Ellroy for Season 2. Despite both being called James and writing hard-boiled detective noir fiction, their stories differ greatly, which is also reflected in the differences between the seasons of the show. The show often uses the same dismal poetics to describe the characters or the setting.
See a propensity for obesity, poverty, a yen for fairy tales.
In a similar way to Burke. Louisiana is not a state, it's an outdoor mental asylum. A lot of time is spent in both the show and Burke's writing on establishing the landscapes to mirror the tone of the works, adding to the sense of smallness and futility the characters feel in the face of what they confront. Both seasons reflect the pessimistic decay of the individual with the rotting civilization around them, best exemplified in the opening credit sequences. The books make heavy use of internal imagery and metaphor to remind characters of the horrors they face, but on TV this is represented literally, be it in Cole's visions or the recurring shape of Casper's burnt-out eyes. Taking its cue from the works of Burke and Ellroy, the show is able to reconstitute their approach to create a visual atmosphere and a set of aesthetic principles that complements the dark, pessimistic themes. Method 2. Intertextuality, or as I like to call it, dank references. A lot of people pored over the show's references to classics of the cosmic horror genre, philosophy, and physics. It shouts out Lovecraftian ideas like the psychosphere.
I get a bad taste in my mouth out here. Aluminum, ash. Like you can smell the psychosphere.
And specific elder gods. But it's Robert Chambers' short story collection from 1895, The King in Yellow, that gets the most screen time. The King in Yellow is a play featured in each short story that drives all who read it mad. The snippets of the play available in the book talk about a character called the Stranger being told to unmask, as well as a lost city called Carcosa, both of which are explicitly referenced in Season 1.
Take off your mask. You're in Carcosa now.
These references are never explained, but simply put there to give the impression of something menacing yet intangible behind the mystery. Veiled, barely understood allusions to an unknown terror is the cornerstone of cosmic horror, which is why it's no surprise that cosmic horror guru H.P. Lovecraft also references Chambers in his story Whisperer in the Darkness. This has the cool effect of Chambers, Lovecraft, and Pizzolato all being in conversation about the same deliberately intangible cosmic lore. But that's not even the end of it. They are all referencing an 1885 story by Ambrose Bierce called An Inhabitant of Carcosa, where a man finds his own grave amongst the ruins of a lost city. Now on top of that, Pizzolato makes veiled references to James Lee Burke's stories by sending Rust and Marty to Iberia in episode 7.
He's from Iberia originally. After CID, he went home. He's sheriff of Iberia Parish,
which is where Burke's Robichaux character is based. Then Pizzolato references his own novel in the show.
Met my mother on leave in Galveston.
We might even view Cole's investigative method as intertextual. This well-read detective draws connections between Freud,
We'd encountered a metapsychotic.
Nietzsche,
When someone once told me time is a flat circle.
and physicist Edward Witten
You ever heard something called the in-brain theory?
to help solve the mystery. And what do you get when you put all these obscure references together? Well, as it turns out, not a lot, and that's kind of the point. When True Detective aired, the internet was abuzz with figuring out its many cryptic references, trying to solve the mystery of the killer while also looking for a grander meaning to the show. And when many of those threads and clues amounted to nothing, people were pissed. But we can better understand this by looking at something called weird fiction. Weird fiction is a genre that defines authors like Lovecraft, Bierce, and Chambers. According to authors Joseph Packer and Ethan Stoneman in A Feeling of Wrongness, weird fiction is uniquely qualified to convey a pessimist philosophy, one that invites people to come for the scares, stay for the lingering sense of life's wrongness. Weird fiction focuses on the weird and the horrors of the unexplained. It has a tendency to end abruptly with no clear ending and stands in contrast to the optimistic view that things happen for a purpose, that life has meaning, and that humans can come to understand that meaning. True Detective uses these references for a similar purpose. Much like Lovecraft's old ones reduce human life to insignificance through their terrifying and unintelligible grandeur, True Detective reduces the significance of its own narrative by alluding to a mythos that is much larger than anything that happens on screen. The references send readers on a futile quest to decode the Yellow King and the letters of Telios de Lorca.
I knocked over a very old volume, the letters of Telios de Lorca,
only to be frustrated by a dead end. And while you may have been mad, what better can we ask from a show inspired by a guy who would later write, "Pessimism is guilty of that most inexcusable of occidental crimes, the crime of not pretending it's all for a reason." By making it a story about the vast unknowable horrors of the universe that references other stories about the vast unknowable horrors of the universe, it creates its own vast unknowable universe. And aside from the intertextuality, the show is littered with loose ends, as noted by Packer and Stoneman. Why did Marty's daughter make this disturbing doll scene? What became of the grander Tuttle conspiracy to abduct children? And just like in real life, we desperately search for clues as to a definitive meaning behind it, only for it to totally reject any meaning at all. The third method the show uses to generate its bleak atmosphere is the most obvious: its themes. While plenty have talked about Cole's pessimism, we noticed fewer people talked about a specific pessimist theme: antinatalism. Antinatalism is the belief that we should abstain from reproducing and that being born isn't all it's cracked up to be. Now sure, that sounds horrible, but you'd be surprised how common an idea it is.
I really believe that anyone who's even thinking about having a child in this world is coldly considering an act of cruelty.
It's also how you might feel every time you watch an Elsa and Spider-Man video. Rust Cole is clearly a fan of this philosophy too.
I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming. Stop reproducing.
It's not just Rust's monologues, as a lot of Marty's shitness is framed by his relationship to his kids and wife. His family is the center of his world and creates the excuses for his most self-destructive tendencies.
You gotta decompress before you can go being a family man.
Meanwhile, the marriageless and childless Rust is something to be feared.
Past a certain age, a man without a family can be a bad thing.
Marty's worst behaviors are usually triggered by the mistreatment of children. After discovering the kids locked up at Ledoux's place, he unceremoniously kills him, an act that needs to be later covered up, being illegal and all. He also beats the shit out of 2 prisoners because they slept with his daughter, also super illegal. Even Cole can't help but get a little extrajudicial from the mistreatment of kids.
Somewhere in there, I emptied a 9 into a crankhead for injecting his infant daughter with crystal.
And when a woman poisons her kids, this happens.
If you get the opportunity, you should kill yourself.
And for Marty, being constantly confronted with the suffering children endure is what makes him retire.
Tweaker tried to dry the kid in a microwave.
Theorist David Benatar, author of the cheerily titled Better Never to Have Been, believed that coming into existence harms everyone. As he said, parents play Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun, aimed of course not at their own heads, but at those of their offspring. There's also a bit of fellow antinatalist Lee Edelman in there, who, to condense extensively, argued that the cultural obsession with the figure of the child was responsible for many of the world's atrocities. Edelman, as a result, entertained the idea that humanity should consider cutting out the baby making and cruise into extinction. One of Pizzolatto's biggest influences is philosopher Eugene Thacker and his book, In the Dust of This Planet. Thacker described a kind of cosmic pessimism that informs much of Cole's philosophy. For Thacker, the kind of cosmic horror seen in the works of H.P. Lovecraft creates a cosmological view understood not simply as the view from interstellar space, but as the view of the world without us. This idea of a world without us informs much of Cole's rambling, the aforementioned intertextuality, as well as the show's aesthetic of the sad, decrepit vistas of Louisiana. But you might be saying, the show's not really pessimistic. Cole discovers the afterlife. He even says this.
Once there is only dark. Yes, any lights winning.
And while many fans felt let down by this about-face, Packer and Stoneman have a different read. They argue that society in general is deeply hostile to pessimism, but that works like Weird Fiction and True Detective serve as a Trojan horse for the revelation that everything is actually terrible. For Packer and Stoneman, we should consider the work of Leo Strauss, who suggested philosophers like Plato and Maimonides added hidden layers to their work to avoid getting Socrates for telling the truth. Strauss thought that several clues could help us discover these two-sided works, including blatant contradiction.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space. Once there is only dark. Yes, any lights winning.
Strauss believed that one way these authors hid their true beliefs was through some disreputable characters.
My off days, I start drinking at noon.
So the authors could plausibly deny their unpopular beliefs when confronted by censors. Which is why, as Strauss says, the greatest literature of the past has so many interesting devils, madmen, beggars, sophists, drunkards, Epicureans, and buffoons. And while the government isn't knocking down anyone's door for quoting Schopenhauer, there is a general cultural taboo for saying shit like this.
We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
That sounds god-fucking awful, Rust.
In fact, the entire relationship between Rust and Marty puts the normal reaction to pessimism front and center.
I wouldn't go around spouting that shit I was you. People around here don't think that way.
This is perhaps why Season 2 was such a letdown, as it had no cohesive central thesis, no mouthpiece, and did its best to tie up all the loose ends in the finale. This created the weird sensation of the second season having the same feel of the first, but with none of the philosophical underpinnings. So was Season 1's ending just a way for Pizzolatto to make the pessimist medicine go down smoother? Well, it's impossible to say, but makes for an interesting reading regardless. Combine all these elements of pessimism, antinatalism, intertextuality, and aesthetics, and you get a groundbreaking show that gets constantly requested by people like you. As always, thanks for watching, guys, and hope you enjoy Season 3. Peace.
All right.